film that wears its social commentary on its sleeves, Daybreakers has multiple points throughout where it could lose you. However, if you stick through to the end, you get an altogether flawed vision, though it's also undoubtedly unique. The movie opens on what seems like a young girl writing a suicide note. She then walks out into the twilight of the rising sun. There's a beautiful shot of the sunlight pouring through the trees before she screams, and awful CG shows her catching on fire and breaking apart. Everything about this movie drips with world building, and it's one of the main factors that drew me to it. The opening credits, for example, show the city abandoned during the daytime. We get incidental shots that establish the state of the world through newspaper headlines and news crawls. As the credits go on, we see the sun setting, and then the city is suddenly bustling and all the more alive as the shutters come up on all the windows. There are dozens of tiny details that really sell this world. We get news reports peppered throughout about the dwindling human population, how blood stores are running low. In the rearview mirrors of his sedan, we see, or rather we don't see, Edward Dalton getting out of his car. We get visually interesting shots like riff-raff teenage vampires smoking off by the light of an overpass, multiple commuter vampires standing in front of an Uncle Sam-style poster that reads in big block letters, "Capture Humans." Even the deformations of vampires who don't get enough blood is hinted at with an ancillary character before it's explained in the story. In perhaps its most on-the-nose metaphor, there are coffee shops that serve different blood types mixed in with their coffee. They start out at 20% blood, but as the shortage continues, their numbers reduce until there is rioting. Edward arrives at his job at Bromley Marks as chief hematologist. As he moves through the corporate building, we see he's uncomfortable with the dystopic nature of his business. He walks past the blood banks, trying not to look at the propped-up humans that are nothing more than livestock being drained for mass consumption. In a meeting, we learn that the lack of human blood will turn every vampire into a rabid beast after a few short weeks, and that they only have enough blood to sustain the population until the end of the month. While speaking with his boss, Charles Bromley, Edward is pressured to move forward with his blood substitute, going from animal trials to full-on vampires. During their test in front of the board, the patient explodes all over the medical team just as the substitute seemed to be doing its job. On his way home, Edward gets into a car accident with a group of runaway humans. He secrets them away in his car while misdirecting the police. Afterward, he lets them escape. Edward's brother Frankie shows up to celebrate his birthday with some 100% human blood wine. Edward won't touch the stuff, and we learn he only hunts animals. He tries to pour the blood down the drain, which causes them to fight. In their argument, Frankie throws the bottle across the room, shattering it against the wall. As a result, a Subsider enters the building. Nothing more than a feral beast, the mostly blind creature attacks the two of them, proving to be immensely strong. In the struggle, Frankie gets tossed aside but manages to get up and decapitate the Subsider before it kills Edward. The next day, Edward wakes up to find one of the humans he'd saved inside his house. She pleads for his help as a vampire they can trust. They give him a map with a designated time to meet someone. As he goes upstairs, we see Frankie sitting on the stairs, presumably having heard the entire conversation. So this is a moment that could potentially lose the audience. Out in full daylight, Edward drives his car using UV protection shields over every window, as well as cameras to navigate the streets. It's a cool idea at its heart. However, the meeting place is in the countryside under the canopy of this giant tree, casting shade over the mystery man and Edward. We've already established that any sunlight is fatal to vampires, but here they are, in the shade of a tree, discussing Elvis's transformation from vampire back to human. Yes, you heard me right. If you can get past the idea that they are standing out in sunlight, but shade is enough to protect Edward, then there's this great tension throughout the scene. They play with shadows at first, obscuring Elvis completely. Then, as they approach each other, little bits of sunlight peer through the leaves, dancing on Elvis's clothing. As he stands partially in the sun, he offers to shake Edward's hand, only to abruptly pull the vampire close to him. He reveals his beating heart, and we're all too aware of the sunlight on their bodies. Frankie shows up, having called in the military to capture these humans, causing a chase scene that, once again, is really interesting in its execution, as they have to use Edward's UV-protected vehicle to escape. The firefight escalates when holes are shot through the UV protection, causing light rays to cut through the car. They also shoot out the cameras, so not only is there the physical danger outside of being shot, but Edward has to dodge beams of light that burn him. The way they escape is through some seriously bad CG, but once free, we get Elvis's tale of how he became human again. See, he was suicidal, blood-deprived, and driving until he couldn't anymore. In a single distracted moment, he hits a guardrail. The sudden impact throws him through the windshield into the sunlight, catching him on fire before he hits a body of water. The shock of it was enough to jumpstart his heart, turning him human once more. Once again, a ridiculous set of circumstances. But if you can get past this... Edward is then introduced to the human resistance group at a local vineyard. We meet Jarvis, who is about to leave the relative safety of the hideout to bring in the largest group of human survivors they've come across. When asked about how safe they are, Elvis replies,
"Being human in a world full of vampires is about as safe as barebacking a $5 whore."
We meet a local politician that is trying to rebuild the human race for the right reasons. Back at the blood bank, we find that more and more humans are being drained to the point of death. More people are becoming Subsiders, congregating under the city. The coffee houses have restricted themselves to 5% blood, which causes the patrons to attack, ripping open the blood bags and SWAT teams to come in to restrain them. It's the first real glimpse of the impending carnage. Edward studies Elvis in an effort to understand his transformation. During his stay at the vineyard, he notices the fermentation tanks and realizes he can use them to recreate Elvis's story. They weld a window into them to create a controlled burn by flooding the tank with sunlight, then pulling oxygen out of the chamber to put out the fire. While transporting a group of humans, Jarvis is ambushed by vampires wielding tranq darts. The military uses their recovered walkie-talkies to zero in on the human resistance. While everyone else is packing, Edward decides to set up the experiment to turn him human, or die trying. It turns out that the leader of the human group is Charles's daughter, Allison. Allison attempts to save her friends and stabs Charles, only for Frankie to come in and knock her out as she tries to escape. After Charles is patched up, he convinces Frankie to turn his daughter. When Charles checks on her later, he finds that she's been drinking her own blood, causing her to turn into a Subsider at an abnormally fast rate. She attacks him before being dragged off. Audrey and Elvis stay back to help Edward get set up in the chamber, and after 3 attempts, he manages to burn himself enough to kickstart his heart. The military swarms the building only to find the fermentation tank empty. Once the SWAT teams have left, Edward, Elvis, and Audrey go out into the sunlight, revealing that Edward is indeed human again. We get reports and glimpses as the military moves into the city to deal with the degenerated vampires. We see them peeking through windows during full sunlight, running through the subways in giant packs. In an especially harrowing moment, we see the captured Subsiders being dragged by military vehicles out into the sunlight, being roasted alive as other vampires watch. We even recognize Charles's daughter, Allie, having pushed herself into becoming a Subsider rather than live as a vampire. She grabs Frankie's attention on her way out and stares him down as she burns. This scene would have been a whole lot more affecting if not for the terrible CG. There are striking images throughout, such as the chains still on fire as they're being dragged through the street, but the CG just undercuts it all. When they try to meet up with their group, Edward finds the rest of the resistance slaughtered in the politician's cabin. They decide to contact Edward's co-worker and seek help in a last desperate plea. He seems amenable at first, but while talking to him, he manages to slip away and they soon realize he had called in the military. Audrey is captured in their escape, while Edward and Elvis manage to get out of the apartment before being cornered by Frankie. At the end of his rope, Frankie agrees to take them to Audrey and surrenders. However, as Elvis approaches to restrain him, he gives in to temptation and feeds. We then see Edward entering the lobby of Bromley Marks alone. He is escorted up to Charles's office, where Audrey's wrists have been slit. Edward offers to give Charles the cure and restock their blood banks in order to save Audrey. Charles reveals that they've had the substitute, and they don't need him anymore. Edward seems to go out of his way to anger Charles, and Charles rips into his throat. We then get flashes to the aftermath of Elvis's attack as Charles feeds on Edward. Charles reacts violently to Edward's blood as we hear Elvis pontificate on how vampires will never survive.
Elvis Presley once said, "Truth is like the sun. You can shut it off for a time, but it ain't going away."
And then it's revealed that if a vampire feeds on a former vampire turned human, then he becomes a human himself. And this is where the movie lost me. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of awesome ideas in the last 10 minutes, but it's the direction that the film went that turns me off. The military swarms on the elevator leading up to Charles's office, only to find him human again, tied to a chair. It only takes a moment before they start feeding on him. Frankie drives into the lobby, takes out a portion of the guards as he does so before he's surrounded, and then his brothers in arms feed on him. Audrey is grabbed and dragged into security office while Edward manages to break into the office, and they kill the remaining vampires in the room. They then turn to the monitors to watch his brother being devoured. What starts as a cycle of vampires feeding on cured humans, only to become humans themselves, and then be torn apart by the next group. I like to title this section The Viscera Orgy. We are subjected to a gory but altogether exultant display as we get slow motion shots of blood and guts and gore just flying through the air as these soldiers tear each other apart. As the vampires eradicate themselves, Edward and Audrey leave the secure room, only to be stopped by Edward's co-worker. Before he's able to kill them, Elvis shoots him in the chest, causing him to explode. We then get this oddly driving score as the three leads stand in a lobby covered in blood and guts as the sun comes up. As the soundtrack drives home just how epic this was, we see them driving off in Elvis's car into the sunrise.
We have a cure. We can change you back. It's not too late.
While it's cool to look at, it makes no sense from a storytelling perspective. What should have happened to make it a cohesive narrative is that when Edward goes back, he offers to be inserted into the blood banks, along with any vampires they've turned, which to be fair was only 3, including himself. Obviously, they'd have to change that aspect. However, this would mean that the blood banks would be restored, but as the vampires drank the stored blood, they'd be turned back to human. The final shot should have been Ethan Hawke dying in the bank while thousands of vampires walked out onto the abandoned morning streets, seeing the sunshine for the first time in almost a decade. How epic is that? Instead, we get 3 characters staring into a sunrise when we've already had that exact same moment roughly 30 minutes before when Edward was turned human again. For a movie that builds the world so effectively, it's obvious that they went for the cool scene at the end as opposed to anything that would supply real closure for the world they built. Now, there's something to be said for doing this. The last act is unlike anything you've seen, and it sticks with you. The thing about Daybreakers is that it takes chances. It does interesting things with its premise that you wouldn't expect. It's those subtle things that captured my attention, but they also weaken the overall film, firmly relegating it to the bargain bin where it could have been another classic. And that's another film down. Do you like the way that Daybreakers ended, or do you have a better idea of how it should have panned out? Let me know at JustinDHeard on Twitter. You can also check up on my novel writing career at justindheard.net. And finally, listen to our in-depth discussions on everything from poetry to video games on the Dubious Consumers podcast. While you wander out into the world for another week of setting fire to the hive, be sure to send out the usual smoke signals of like, share, and subscribe. For now, this has been Dubious Consumption, and I'm Outro.